Good afternoon, and welcome to Session 3 of the CERC Doctoral Students Forum. Our first presenter is Maximilian Vierlboeck. He's received his Bachelor and Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the Technical University in Munich. He previously worked as a product design engineer at Knorr-Bremse and New York Air Brake before coming to Stevens, where he received the Provost Doctoral Fellowship Award. In his past research and work, Max has focused on product design and technical architecture. He has published agile budgeting methodologies for product development and is currently working on system requirements engineering to facilitate better designs by addressing complexity. Max will be presenting his research, Complexity at the Requirement Stage, a Novel Paradigm for System Development. Over to you, Max.
Hello. My name is Maximilian Vierlboeck. I'm a PhD candidate at the Stevens Institute of Technology, and today I will be presenting my research about complexity at the requirement stage. To begin with, I would like to briefly go over the agenda for today. So first, we will introduce the problem and situation, how everything came to be, what it is about. Then we will take a look at the science and state of the art to understand the foundation on which this research is built. With that foundation, we'll then outline the objectives of the research as well as the methodology that was applied, and that will show the overall process and what is planned to be achieved. Lastly, we will look at a quick summary, and I will provide a conclusion with the main takeaways of this presentation. So, when I started my PhD journey, like most students at that stage, I was looking for a topic that would keep me engaged, and given the endless options, I didn't know where to start, but I did know one thing, and that was that I sort of have an obsession with product and system design. I'm fascinated by anything that is engineered, and it doesn't matter if it's the size of an airplane, a smartphone, or something mundane, just a toaster. And with that, I started looking at different products to understand why some succeed and some fail. And so, when we look at a few examples, such as the B-52 airplane here, we see that some products have great design, and despite this airplane, for example, being developed in the 50s with less than 10 requirements, it's still being used today. On the other hand, there are examples for products and systems that did not fulfill their purpose, such as the 1983 Challenger space shuttle that unfortunately failed its mission in 1986. More recently, we have examples such as the 2016 Galaxy Note 7, which shortly after being released and shipped to customers, started unexpectedly just going up in flames. Eventually, Samsung had to recall the entire product line and just accept the losses that came with that. These examples show that failure is omnipresent, and when we look for a reason, we see that most often it is related to complexity that is inherent to that design of these systems and products. To make things more difficult, complexity is in everything we design. And now naturally, when we think about it, no developer intends for their creation to fail. We all want to succeed. But complexity creeps into our creations and makes it very, very difficult to succeed. So, we have to realize that no matter what we're dealing with, we have a complexity problem. And that is what my research wants to address. Now, in order to first figure out the dynamics of complexity in product and system design, I looked for the roots of it all. And it shows that all complexity is in some way connected to requirements. Requirements are defined at the beginning of the development process, and they can originate from two main sources. One source are stakeholders who have an interest in the design, and as a result, they influence and drive requirements. That was the case for the Galaxy Note 7, where the miniaturization of the product was of such high priority that it ended up with significant space constraints for the battery. This led to the chance or the potential of electrical components inside the cell touching, which would cause the ignition. On the other hand, restrictions and conditions are factors for requirements. These can be regulations, rules, or just environmental factors, which was the case for the Challenger aircraft that we saw. The shuttle had an O-ring in one of the boosters that was not rated nor capable of withstanding low temperatures. Unfortunately, the night before the 1986 launch, temperatures were much lower than ever tested, and as a result, the O-ring did not function as planned, it did not seal, which led to the catastrophe. All these factors and specifications are defined in what is called requirement engineering. And after the requirement engineering, they are realized in the development and design stage. Here, we have two possible outcomes. One is a simple and elegant design with little or manageable complexity, and on the other side, we have a complex and potentially problematic design. This fork here is where my research wants to operate by pushing towards the left and facilitating a simpler, more robust, and overall better design. Now, regarding how this comes together with complexity, we have to look at the entire development process to understand the dynamics. So we already saw the two steps of requirement definition and development and design. With the results of these, the system goes into implementation, which is then followed by verification, maintenance, and eventually the end of life. In this chain that we see here, complexity originates in most cases either from the design and development or the implementation. Yet, requirements standing on top of this chain, they direct all other steps that come after them. And as such, they have a very, very disproportionate influence, but at the same time, they are set before we know much about the remaining steps. And that puts us in a difficult spot because that creates risk and uncertainty. We do not know yet how things will pan out, but at the same time, we have to define the specifications. So if something unexpected or unwanted occurs down the line, changes have to be implemented reactively. That can be difficult, costly, and in some cases, completely impossible if there is irreversible damage. When we look for estimates, how much a single change could cost, some studies start at over $10,000 for one. So we see that the dynamics behind requirements and complexity are very important to product and system design and even acquisition. As such, the problems therein are what my research wants to address because of that importance. Now, before we get to the solution and the approach and research itself, I want to take a quick look at what the state of the art is and what research has been done in these fields. Regarding complexity and its science, Weaver defined the origins in 1948 by outlining two general categories of complexity. One type is organized complexity, and the other type, the counterpart, is disorganized complexity. The type seen here on the left is characterized by numerous variables in the system, which still allows for separate analysis though. As a result, the individual behavior of each entity is relevant and has to be accounted for. On the right side, disorganized complexity is characterized by an abundance of variables, which creates the necessity for comprehensive analysis, and the individual behavior gives way to analysis that is related to statistical methods. So, with this starting point, and sort of the inception of complexity, over time, the science branched out into various fields. And today, we can see many representatives for complexity science in numerous areas. I would like to briefly go through the most popular metrics out there so everyone can see some names they recognize from their field. And also, the names and representatives that we're about to see were something that I started analyzing to understand the current state of the art in complexity science. So first, to begin with, we have Shannon, who worked on communication and signal complexity. We have other representatives such as Kaufman's At Home in the Universe, which is more located in biology and chemistry and complexity thereof. We have then other representatives such as McCabe's A Complexity Measure, which is situated in the computer engineering and software complexity. We have other representatives of the physical or physics space, which are, for example, Gell-Mann and Lloyd's information measure, which deals with information and the physics aspects. Then we have additional representatives for signal communication complexity, Holland's Hidden Order, a great book. I can only recommend it. It's not what everyone expects when they read the title. It's a very entertaining read. We have additional fields such as Portugali's complexity theories of cities, which is social engineering and network and the complexity therein. One last popular representative for the the signal and communication complexity is Crutchfield and Young's statistical complexity. Here we again see the relation to disorganized complexity. And last but not least, we have researchers who worked with design and manufacturing, such as El Maraghi, who worked in engineering design and manufacturing. Now, when we look at the map here and we put in remaining dots, how all these are connected, and what I did here was I evaluated them with cross-references, we see that this space emerges. And that space is representing the complexity science today. It can be divided into areas, and these areas are all part of different engineering domains. Unfortunately, that adds a level of diversity to the entire scientific field. And that diversity comes with a problem, since solutions developed in one of these areas might not necessarily work in another. And so the research I'm working on plans to consider this diversity to prevent the creation of a limited niche solution. Now, regarding requirement engineering and the current state of the art, we see a similar picture. Overall, we can say requirements, they're omnipresent, used in many industries, and as such, they have been the subject of different research streams as well. Today, we have different standards from various organizations, NASA, ISO, IEEE, many more. Naturally, each of these standards has their own characteristics. We can boil them down to their core, and they all deal with some sort of structure, organization, and categorization, which can look something like what we're going to see here on the right. In this case, we have functional, non-functional requirements, performance requirements, resource requirements, interaction requirements. We can then subdivide into quality and trade-off requirements, and obviously we have input, output, and all that comes with it. Again, the variety and different approaches, together with the many fields that requirement engineering and requirements are to be found in, creates the same diversity that we saw with complexity. And as such, my research here as well tries to create a solution that can work with different approaches to not be limited by the diversity. So, with these problems and the state of the research to serve as a foundation, I would like to now move to the idea that is underlying my research. And to explain that, I want to go back to the dynamics and the development that we looked at before. So when I was thinking about the influences and dynamics in this chart, I realized that at the requirement stage, there is no way to consider nor understand the complexity that is introduced. And to address this, I developed the idea to come up with a perspective approach that allows for the consideration of complexity and the potential thereof without the need to go through the entire chain and process. That means that if such a perspective approach and methodology were available, it would become possible to not only consider, but even to some extent manage the complexity that is introduced by manipulating the right parameters if the influences are known. Effectively, that would flip the entire influence chain that we've seen here upside down, and all of a sudden we could include the effects of potential interactions that would appear down the line from the beginning. And more importantly, this would allow us to, as an end result, turn the potential complexity that we see here into assessed complexity. And as such, we could move from a reactive stance to a prospective consideration, which would greatly reduce risk and also remove the previously predominant uncertainties that we talked about. Of course, it is difficult to exactly predict the complexity, as we have seen when we looked at disorganized versus organized complexity. Some interactions cannot be defined 100%. They have to be treated with statistical measures, and thus predictions can only be made based on probabilities. Regardless, understanding the assessed and potential complexity would allow us to account for it and drive the development to an acceptable complexity level. This becomes especially important given the fact that complexity cannot only be a threat for good design, but can actually pose a competitive advantage if it's under control. To achieve this, and also not fall for the limitations that we discussed, the following goals were set for the research. For one, obviously, to enable the prospective assessment. In addition, elicit structure from requirements. We are going to get to that in a second. 3, definition of a complexity metric that then allows for the relationship definition of how requirement complexity relates to design complexity. And last, to create an automatic framework to avoid the limitations that we have seen. And I'm going to get to that in more detail in a second. Now, with these goals, the design research methodology is being applied, and I created a process that implements those ideas. To understand the methodology, we need to look again at the development and design process that leads to the unforeseen behavior. Treating the standard process as one stream here, the methodology that was developed as a part of my research opens up a parallel stream. And this parallel path allows for the prospective assessment, which is then disconnected from the progress of the actual development that we see here right now. So at the step of requirement definition, we add a fork. And in this step, we analyze the requirements, the document, the specs, through natural language processing so that we can extract the connections and networks within. This we can then use to analyze with metrics to define the assess the complexity potential. With that potential then, we can anticipate and predict to a certain extent unforeseen behavior. So this prediction allows us to prospectively get a picture of a potential outcome, without having to go through the actual process that is here shown on the top. And I want to talk a little bit more about the natural language processing part here. The NLP step will look at contextual information and infer connections based on defined parameter to understand the requirement body completely independent from the organization or standard that is being used. So we're not trying to make up something new here and change what is being used at NASA, for example. But for instance, it's possible that numerous requirements in one document are related to the gross weight of a product. Maybe none of them actually mention the word mention the word weight in their text. Now, in these cases, the natural language processing step will define these connections and infer the information underlying the requirements, which will then be used to gauge the complexity potential. Of course, this NLP approach comes with major challenges, since context can be specific and depend on circumstances. So the NLP 4RE, which is short for Natural Language Processing for Requirement Engineering, not my abbreviation, it's actually the field and what these people call it. This approach is currently in development, and it's what I would like to look at last. In order to see what possibilities are there when we're talking about NLP 4RE, I analyzed the existing solutions of that domain, and unfortunately it turned out that no existing solution was suitable or applicable. All other options either had some limitations or targeted a niche area that made it very difficult to be transferred. So in order to achieve the goals that we outlined 2 slides ago, a new approach needed to be developed. And to address the limitations, for example, input restrictions or human supervision necessities, a modularized approach is currently being created. This modularized approach consists of the core algorithm that is being supplied by the corpus, which is the requirement body, and on the other side, a knowledge base. By separating the knowledge base from the algorithm and the corpus, adjustments can be made as to the contextual rules or inference criteria, for example. These changes then can be used to apply the entire approach to a different field or company just by exchanging one piece without the need to adjust the other 2 pillars. So with this modularized approach for NLP and the overall methodology that was described in the last slide, the research here and what I presented attempts to address the problem of complexity at the requirement stage in a novel and also adaptable way. So to sum everything up, I want to give a quick recap about what we looked at today. In the beginning, we discussed the circumstances that despite our advanced engineering methodologies, today failure is omnipresent and system complexity is a contributing factor. We also looked at the disproportionate influence of requirements in the development process of systems and products and how it relates to complexity. We saw the reactive approaches and change management that is currently being used, and that a prospective approach is a way to address the shortcomings. Eventually, through this prospective approach, the research I presented plans to enable a predictive assessment and, as a result, reduce or greatly even reduce risk and uncertainty to also propel a simpler design with acceptable complexity. So, to conclude this presentation, I would like to emphasize 2 things that I think are the key and core messages that I wanted to convey today. For one, complexity is in every system we design, and it can cause great problems through emergence for all of us in system development, design, acquisition, and many more. To address this, we need to switch away from our current reactive approaches to a prospective assessment so we can benefit from the reduced risk that this will provide, and we can also propel elegant design. I hope that through my research, I can help to create more products that are as elegant and great, such as one of my personal all-time favorites, the classic iPod. I still have mine, it still works, and I still love using it after all these years. It was very exciting to see all the fascinating content at this year's research review, and it was great to present my own work. I would like to thank Cirque for the opportunity, and I look forward to seeing everyone again at future events.
Thank you. So Maximilian, can you see the questions here? I think there's 3 of them.
Let me see. In the chat?
Yeah, in the chat.
All right.
Starting with Beth Wilson.
Yes, Beth. I like the idea of being able to.
Here, so we'll read the question to you, Max. But yeah, you could see
All right.
it. So I like the idea of being able to measure and predict the complexity. Do your measures provide insight into how to react to that assessment? Can we use this insight to reduce unnecessarily complexity?
Yes. Beth, thank you very much for your question. Yes, that is the plan. So the measure that we're currently working on, which hopefully will finish by the beginning of next year, is actually supposed to indicate what the drivers are. So it even will be possible to do sort of like iterative changes where we see how something affects it, so we can see how we can modify it and drive it moving forward.
Okay, so the second question, it was actually from me. So I understood the concept, but is it possible for you to conceptualize an example of how this would be used in practice?
Yes, of course, I'd love to. So an example would be, let's say we start a new development where we define the requirements. Let's choose, for example, we do a new Mars lander. What would happen is once the requirements are defined, we would use what I'm researching here to assess the complexity that we're putting into the system. We would get the perspective and potential complexities out of that assessment, which we could then compare and see if we're okay with it or if we need to manage. We could even see what the drivers are and if we need to modify them to get to a lower risk level that we think is acceptable for this. That can then be repeated again throughout the development, so we can always have a grip on what we're actually dealing with.
So just kind of a follow-up to that. So the requirements in a model-based system engineering world, the requirements are used in conjunction with structural and functional design. Would you be able to include those features into measures of complexity, at least at a top level?
That is the plan, yes. Okay. So to take those requirements, to analyze them, and maybe even, that was one of our ideas later on, to maybe even add it to trade space analysis in the future. Maybe we can add a third dimension to that where complexity is one of them, so we can actually treat it as a parameter that would also then go with the functional design.
Okay. Lance Sherry asked a question. First he said, Max, thank you for a very interesting talk. Have you investigated whether complexity is introduced through design, i.e. gratuitous complexity, or as a result of the environment in which the system will be fielded, i.e. required complexity?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we have looked into that. For now, we are more focused on the first one, where we are saying what complexity is introduced by design. But it is not impossible to also consider something such as the environment. There are actually good examples where people have developed now solutions for global warming that have then greatly suffered from environmental requirements and conditions. And we have that in mind. It's just not for now the primary focus, but there's definitely room to include it in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Max.